When soft words had no effect, his anger knew no bounds. Chronicler Geoffrey Malaterra on Count Roger of Sicily. Welcome to Fortune's Wheel Podcast, a podcast that explores the infinitely fascinating and oft overlooked high and late Middle Ages. I'm Jonathan, your host, and what you can expect to hear on this show is a story of our collective Western history, warts and all, unabashedly and unashamed. This season, or bend in the narrative as I call it, is called All Roads Lead to Clermont, and it attempts to bring us up to date on the West, leading right up to the call for Holy War. We've followed the reign of King Henry II of England and his two brothers, Robert Curthose and Henry Beauclerc up north, and taken a quick snapshot of Iberia crumbling under the weight of the heavy Almoravid conquest already. In addition to those, we've also established the two major thoroughfares that Crusaders would be using in the coming confrontation, the Venetian-controlled Adriatic and the Kingdom of Hungary. And with this episode, we return to our old friends in Italy and Sicily one more time, the Hautevilles. An interesting dynamic is formed there. On the last episode, we saw two nephews duking it out for supremacy, while their uncle tried his best to keep the kids separated. We will see Uncle Roger do more of that on this episode, but he will also be dealing with things at home in Sicily. Like, for instance, what in the world do I do with all those fierce fighting men now that I've conquered an entire island? Well, before we begin, please consider joining us on Patreon, where you can enjoy more than 20 hours of bonus content as of this recording for as low as just $1 a month. We're currently in the middle of an ongoing fascinating series covering the legendary Alexius Komnenos. Join our growing community and help this show bring our shared story to life. This is episode 159, entitled Rebellions and Conquests, Hauteville Edition, Part 2. Thank you for your support, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. In his younger years, Count Roger fell head over heels with a Norman noblewoman named Judith of Evreux. They were, if you remember, actually in love with one another, and theirs wasn't a marriage of convenience or alliance necessarily. Rather, Judith was smuggled out of Normandy and brought to Roger in Sicily way back when Roger had only just taken Messina and Traina. It was all in the name of love, of course. She married Roger when he was still a penniless Norman knight under his overbearing brother, Robert Guiscard. She could have married much higher, but she chose Roger, and they married in 1061 when they were both in their mid to late 20s. They had a daughter together within a few years, and they named her Matilda. It was this Matilda who would marry Count Raymond of Provence, soon to be the famous crusader Raymond of Toulouse. Judith sadly died in 1076 after 15 years of their fabled marriage. It's crazy for us to think about today, but marriage was just a different thing back then for both men and women. Love was, it was still a strange concept. We're still at least a century away from that shifting in some widespread way, though. You still saw it, of course, like in the case of Roger and Judith, but mostly, instead of a romantic love we today cherish, it was more of a sense of obligation and loyalty, which, if you think about it, is still quite a powerful thing. Just different. I'm not even sure I've wrapped my head around such a marital relationship, but even sleeping with others was seen differently, which is where Jordan de Hauteville comes into our story. Sometime in the early 1070s, when his father Roger was still married to the love of his life, Judith. See, Jordan was not Judith's son. Jordan was an illegitimate son of some unnamed woman. We can presume a noblewoman. Though altogether different than Bohemond's birth, Jordan was treated by Roger almost exactly like Guiscard treated Bohemond. Jordan was given major military and political responsibilities as he got older, and we've seen some of them already. Jordan de Hauteville was as much in the thick of the Norman conquest of Sicily as anyone was. For a time, Jordan was even Roger's presumptive heir, though when Malta was born, that honor transferred, much in the same way as it did when Roger Borsa was born back on the mainland. So, after Judith's death, Roger grieved, certainly, but as things went in 1077, he went on to marry Aremberga, which gave him a strong alliance with the county of Mortain. Roger and Aremberga had a litter as husband and wife, but again, Jordan was growing into a pre-adolescent and he was ready to start accompanying Dad on all of his campaigns. Now, first with Roger and Aremberga came Geoffrey. Malta, who was named Count of Troina, came next, followed by Matilda. Yes, another Matilda. Now, this Matilda would marry Guige III of Albion. Next came Flandina, who married a nobleman from northern Italy named Henry de Vasto. But more on Flandina soon enough. She wouldn't stay with that mere nobleman for long. And lastly, Constance. She most likely became a nun, which is medieval historian for no plot development available. Well, sadly, Roger's second wife, Aremberga, died in 1087 after just 10 years of marriage. Now, it wasn't long before Count Roger married his third and last wife, Adelaide, niece of the powerful Marquis of Savona in northern Italy. The year was 1089. She was just 14 years old at the time. For context, Roger was 58. So, yeah. Now, Adelaide was said to be extremely bright and unbelievably beautiful, and with Roger, she would give birth to two sons. Simon was born in 1093 and was second in line for the title of Count of Sicily behind Geoffrey. And 2 years later, in 1095, came Roger, who, well, I honestly don't want to say anything about this kid's future because, wow, just trust me. Little Roger's life will unfold in due time, and it will definitely be worth your time. Now, for the time being, as of 1095, the year of Urban's call for crusade, mind you, little Roger would be third in line for the title of Count of Sicily. So, we have Geoffrey, Malta, Simon, and Roger, all in line for Dad's title and landholdings and wealth by 1095. But we can't forget about Jordan, who may be illegitimate, but he is also being groomed daily to take over his dad's everything, basically. Jordan and Bohemond are living parallel lives in some sense. The only difference is that Guiscard is dead by 1089, and Count Roger is still very much alive. One thing is worth noting is that Jordan, unlike Bohemond, by the year 1089, was married. Jordan actually married, strangely, his stepmother's sister. Yeah, in fact, Roger's other son, Geoffrey, also married one of his stepmother's sisters, too. It's kind of weird. Now, consanguinity is defined by blood, not legal status, unlike today. Now, do you believe me that the whole marriage thing was just different back then? It definitely is hard to wrap your head around. But with Count Roger's family situations behind us, let's get back to this whole conquest here. The year is 1089. Roger's married again. The two half-brothers in Apulia are holding on to a tenuous peace at the moment, and Sicily has one last major pocket of resistance to deal with before the island is completely, and I mean completely, under Norman control. And this last little pocket of resistance is the place that the Emir of Syracuse's wife and son, along with the city's nobility, fled to just before Syracuse fell. Now, Count Roger readied his forces to take the land in and around the city of Nato in late 1089, but word came to him from Nato itself. Chronicler Geoffrey Malaterra writes, quote, "Then the people of Nato, seeing the whole of Sicily obedient to the Count, and that for them to resist any further was useless, knowing that To struggle in vain and after wearisome exertion to gain nothing at the end, except hatred, is the height of folly. Well, they took counsel amongst themselves and thought it best to be reconciled with the count. Thus they chose envoys from their ranks and sent them to him. They met the count at Melito, where he was then staying, and in the month of February, in the year from the Lord's incarnation 1090, they made peace. The count remitted 2 years' census from them and sent back with them his son Jordan, to whom he had given both land and a wife, to receive the town which they were surrendering. Jordan had been well taught by his father. He received the city, built a citadel there, and arranged matters as he wished in fealty to his father. Bernevart's wife and son fled to Africa. Hence, all of Sicily was at peace. End quote. And that's how it was done. Between the years of 1061 and 1090, Roger de Hauteville, son of the petty Norman lord of the Cotentin, Tancred, and brother to the likes of William Ironarm, Drogo, Humphrey, and Robert Guiscard, well, he went from a literal penniless knight to one of the most powerful figures in Christendom during those 29 years, largely in Sicily. He devoted his entire adult life to bringing Sicily under his control, one village and one city, one valley, one mountain peak, and one coastline at a time, over the course of almost 3 decades, and in the process restored the island to its Christian roots. Muslims were free to live and thrive there, as were Jews and Eastern Orthodox Christians, but Latin Christianity ruled the land, and each pope Roger lived through was forever in Roger's debt for this. With Nato secured, Count Roger had effectively shut off nearly all Muslim piracy along Italy's vast coastline, something we cannot underestimate the value of. So just to put a fine point to the whole thing, in 1090, with the fall of Nato, the Norman conquest of Sicily was complete. It was somewhat akin to the U.S. Census Bureau declaring, quote-unquote, the American frontier was closed way back in the year 1891. Expansion was finished. It was now time to settle and be, hopefully, at peace. But once borders are established, the real building begins. So Roger had the whole island to himself, right? For 3 decades, it had been flooded with the fiercest fighting men in Europe and elsewhere, not to mention North Africa. Normans were the dominant force, whether they were fighting in England, France, Italy, or Sicily, with the exception of maybe those Seljuk Turks. There was just nothing more lethal than these two fighting forces, the Normans and the Seljuks, in the late 11th century. And Sicily at the time, Sicily was chock full of Norman warriors. Well, what do you do with the most lethal men of the era on your island when you no longer have need of them? You've been pumping the island full of them for decades, and now, all of a sudden, they're not needed? Well, that was only the first problem Roger faced when his conquest was complete. Another was the fact that he was Catholic. Catholics were, without question, vastly, and I mean vastly, outnumbered in Sicily at the time. The population was predominantly Greek Orthodox and Muslim, with a smattering of Jews here and there as well. They seemed to have lived in peace, generally speaking, but he had implemented a serious shift in culture on the island. It was no longer ruled by Muslims, and neither would it now be ruled by Greek Orthodox Christians. The minority Catholics were now going to rule over 2 groups, plus the Jewish populations, who have been in the majority for several hundred years at one point or another. How in the world was he going to make peace happen in such a situation? Culturally, in 1090, 1091? Culturally, Sicily had a serious problem. Well, like any good Norman ruler, Roger needed to give his knights, these fierce fighting men, something to busy themselves with first. He had to deal with the armies just left there first. If left to their own devices, they would inevitably become a threat to him. They would challenge him at every turn and all at once, most likely. See, Roger needed the men off his island, but he couldn't just kick them off. That's bad form. So he looked for a place he could use them, and just 62 miles, or 100 kilometers, to the south of Sicily is a tiny little island ruled by Muslims. This was the island of Malta, and Roger set his sights there in the year 1091. But why Malta? Well, Malaterra tells us that Roger chose Malta because it was the closest one. Yeah, that's it. It was close. That's all the reason one needed in the 11th century to invade, I suppose. So, off to Malta they went. Well, not so fast, though. See, just as Count Roger was readying his ships, he received a letter from Calabria, from one of his noblemen, a Calabrian named Miniseries of Acquarenza, a man who once told Roger that the only reason he would like to see the Count's face again is if he could inflict harm upon it. So, yeah, there's a little bad blood there, apparently. But the letter from Miniseries of Acquarenza was a rather rude declaration that he would not participate in Roger's conquest of Malta. As you know, in a feudal system built upon obligation, this was an unforgivable letter, an unforgivable declaration, and public, which made it 1,000 times worse. Malaterra tells us that Count Roger was, quote-unquote, absolutely furious. Pressing the pause button on Malta, Roger crosses into Calabria and sends Peter of Mortain to raise an army there ahead of his arrival, which he does. In just 8 short days, Peter of Mortain raises a pretty massive army, a testament to the stability that Count Roger has brought to the region since Calabria's days under Guiscard's direct control. Calabrians were now more than willing to rally behind Roger. And Malaterra writes, quote, "And in the month of May of 1091, he brought this to the Count. The Count then marched to Acquarenza and laid a fearsome siege to the castrum." End quote. Now, needless to say, Miniseries was frightened into submission. Bringing horses, mules, gold, and other treasures with him, Miniseries humbled himself at Count Roger's feet and asked for forgiveness. In his magnanimity, I say with a bit of sarcasm, Count Roger only took 1,000 solidi, which is a pretty large sum, I might add, from Miniseries, and forgave the nobleman. And while Roger was in Calabria, there was still one pocket that was rather rude to him still. The last holdout in Calabria with such an attitude toward the Hauteville regime. So Roger decided to take his army to it. I mean, he did raise it, so you might as well use it, right? The city was Cosenza. And just for kicks, Roger ordered his army to remind them, the Cosenzans, who was in charge. They burned the fields around the city, vineyards and olive orchards were burnt en masse, and after just 3 days of terror, with no warning, Roger moved on to the town of Arata. In Arata, he ordered his Calabrian army to disband for the duration of 15 days. In 15 days, they were to return to Capo Scalambri, and from there, they would all sail to Malta. Now, while in Capo Scalambri, Roger's son Jordan was readying his own ships for the invasion of Malta, but he was summoned by Pops to join him one day. Jordan was convinced that the old man would never join the navy and invade Malta himself, and the boy was fully expecting that responsibility to be delegated to him. But Count Roger shocked the young man with the delegation of protecting Sicily while Dad was away. Still a very high honor, one that anyone would dream of, but Jordan was young, intelligent, and a courageous knight, and he loved being in the thick of the fighting. I've compared Jordan to Bohemond in many ways, but he could also be compared to another one of Count Roger's nephews, his right-hand man from years and years earlier, young Tancred. Do you remember that particular Tancred? This was the Tancred that would have surely become a legend like his two uncles if he hadn't been tricked, cornered, and slaughtered on a mountain peak in Sicily before Jordan was born. Young, handsome, and just one hell of a warrior by all accounts. These were the guys you wanted in the field of battle. But Count Roger ordered his son Jordan back to Sicily to maintain a powerful presence there while he was away. And Jordan was, indeed, a powerful presence. Malaterra writes, quote, Hearing his father telling him to do something very different from what he had thought, he was quite astonished, and tried to dissuade his father from the course of action he had outlined. He proclaimed tearfully that it would rather be better, if it was pleasing to his father, that he, being young, should be given this task, while his father should enjoy the benefits of rest and relax after his many labors like a man receiving the rewards of old age. It would be less harmful if he, a young man of little worth, perished in this very hazardous enterprise than a man of such authority and wisdom. The Count was furious with his son's words. End quote. Now, why would Count Roger be furious, though? It sounds like Jordan was willingly ready to sacrifice his life to achieve his father's ambitions. Well, guys like Roger, they don't retire. Retirement is very much a modern concept, and Jordan straight up tells Pops to retire. That is, he says, remove yourself from your ambitions. That's what he told Roger. Now, Roger took that quite differently than you and I would take that. He all but screamed at his son that, in Malaterra's words, quote unquote, as he wished to be the first in owning and granting property, so it was only right that he should be the foremost in acquiring it. Also seems to make sense. But did you catch what was really exchanged between father and son there? If you read between the lines, Roger was adamant that the person giving out land should be the one to acquire that land. Jordan wanted to usurp Dad's privileged position. To Roger, this was a quiet coup happening, like right to his face. He ordered Jordan back to Sicily, but he ordered Jordan to maintain an army in the field, ships ready at the port, and to live out of a tent should he send word that he needed reinforcements. And Jordan did just that. It's now July of 1091 when Count Roger set sail for Malta, 3 months after his original plan. Malaterra writes, quote, the Count's ship had sailed faster than the others and was the first to reach land. He and 13 knights disembarked, mounted their horses, and attacked the great host of the local inhabitants, which had come to the shore to meet them and bar their way. The Count killed a number of them. The rest fled, and he pursued them for a considerable distance, cutting down the stragglers. End quote. It was a long day, but by the time his men returned to the beach, the rest of his fleet had arrived and were disembarking. They camped right there in the sand that night. Now let's keep that in mind here. The year again is 1091. Count Roger was born in 1031, and he was chasing down enemies on an invasion he was spearheading on an unfamiliar island at 60 years old. And the guy woke up the next morning, gathered his men into lines, and marched on the nearby city of Medina, which was also, coincidentally, the island's capital city. Before the Muslims moved in, Medina was known as Melite, and it was still known on the island. It was still known as the island's capital. Even as far back as classical Rome, it was the island's capital. Today, Medina is still known as Medina, only with a slight spelling change, and it's known as the Silent City, due to the fact that no automobiles are allowed inside the city bounds. Now, city is actually a bit of an overstatement, actually. Medina today has but a few hundred people living in what feels like a Game of Thrones set piece, you could describe it as. It's narrow, winding streets, massive bastions. I mean, Medina is a time capsule, and it's no longer the capital of Malta either today. Medina is nearly 9 miles or 14 kilometers away from the modern capital of Valletta. So, looking at Malta, I tried to figure out where Count Roger landed his forces initially, given that medieval chroniclers weren't exactly known for their GPS precision. One could say he landed near Medina and marched inland, but it's not that simple. Malta is basically a sun-bleached limestone archipelago in the middle of the beautiful Mediterranean Sea, ringed by vertical cliffs. And I mean vertical cliffs. The islands themselves are almost entirely composed of 5 distinct layers of sedimentary rock laid down over the course of millions of years, beginning sometime between 20 and 35 million years ago, depending on where you are on the island. Now, over those millions of years, the European plate and the African plate are slamming into each other so slowly that it would make a sloth look like the Flash. But there was a tiny plate that broke off from this collision called the Pelagian Block. Malta is the topmost peak of this Pelagian Block, and strangely, Malta is still rising today. Just a few millimeters each year, but rising all the same. Because of this tectonic upheaval, Malta is jam-packed with marine fossils. But being limestone, it has been a haven for people with a flair for architecture to be drawn to for thousands of years. There are no major rivers precisely because of the limestone. This porous island makes agriculture quite a nightmare, unless that is you're farming dust and disappointment. Then you probably can find quite a bit of success. The first people arrived from Sicily around 5900 BC, probably some Neolithic farmers with a dream and terrible navigation. Boy, would they be sorry. However, between 3600 and 2500 BC, Malta entered what's known as the Temple period, in which the people of Malta built some of the oldest freestanding stone structures on Earth. Older than even the Great Pyramids, some say, though the science is slowly shifting on that one. These were megalithic monsters, too. Then, silence. For some reason, civilization on Malta just collapsed. And no word of why. No word of where they went. Malta just fell off the radar. Now, shortly after, the Bronze Age Phoenicians found the place uninhabited, and they took over, followed by the Carthaginians, the Romans, the Byzantines, who introduced Greek Orthodoxy around the year 400 AD, and finally the Arabs, who in the year 870 AD ransacked the place and unceremoniously left it to rot. However, over the centuries, a few stragglers from North Africa made their ways to the island and settled into very small villages until around the year 1048, when Muslims pushed into Malta more fully, bringing much more in terms of Arabic culture, as well as Islam as an island-wide mandate. Within a decade, Malta was all Muslim, but it was also catapulted into the 11th century with various Arab technologies such as advanced irrigation and other things, which made Malta much more hospitable to larger populations. Now, decades later, by the time Count Roger made landfall, Malta was a vaguely functioning society, but it was not fortified at all. Defense came in the form of those limestone cliffs I mentioned. Studying the cliffs and beaches of Malta, the places I feel were very poor spots for Count Roger to land his fleet were the ones actually closest to the city of Medina. The cliffs along the southern coast, like Dingley, would be absolute suicide, as those cliffs are as high as 250 feet. Now, around to the northeast side is the Grand Harbor / Valletta area, but there were settlements there that may offer a quick resistance, not allowing him to fully disembark his forces before being engaged. Now, less likely, but still possible, would be St. Paul's Bay, which is north of Medina. Now, why it's called St. Paul's Bay, by the way? Well, because legend states that on his way to Rome, his very windy way to Rome, St. Paul himself shipwrecked there. Yeah, right there in Malta. So St. Paul's Bay is possible, but there's a much more likely place. It's called Marsexlock Bay. Marsexlock is a naturally sheltered bay in the southeast of Malta. It's one of the few calm bits of water around the island and has been used by nearly everyone, from the Phoenicians to even the British Navy centuries after this. It's very flat, which would make disembarking those horses way easier than anywhere else. And it's also only 12 miles, or 20 kilometers, to Medina, too. It's just a day's march or ride, allowing Count Roger to move quickly and still catch them largely unprepared. And looking at later invasions, we see that Marsexlock's Bay would be used again and again and again and again, including the Ottoman invasion of Malta in 1565. So my money on where Count Roger landed would be Marsex Bay. So supposing Count Roger landed there, by day 3 he had laid siege to Malta's capital. Malaterra writes, quote, "Neither the commander who ruled over the town and the island, nor his fellow citizens were accustomed to military activities, and they were terrified by the presence of their enemies. They requested of their own free will a safe conduct, so that they might come and discuss matters with the count. He agreed, and they came to the tent to ask him for peace terms." End quote. Roger received them graciously, and they tried to negotiate, but, come on. Count Roger had all the negotiating chips here. Count Roger demanded that all Christians be freed, to which they responded with all those Christian prisoners, as well as horses, mules, every single weapon they had, seemingly, and huge, huge sums of money. Now, Roger made an annual payment agreement with them and made them swear loyalty to the Count of Sicily in perpetua, regardless of who the Count may be. Malaterra says, quote, "The Christian prisoners left the city, shedding tears of joy and moved to the depths of their hearts by their freedom, holding crosses in their right hands made of wood or reeds, whatever each of them found first, singing the Kyrie eleison, and then flung themselves at the Count's feet. Seeing this, our men were bathed in floods of tears by such a pious sight." End quote. Well, without thinking about the logistics of it all, once everyone was on board the ships, Roger was informed that the weight of all the extra people may make it a dangerous trip back all the way to Sicily. But Roger was a God-fearing man, by all accounts, and he trusted they would make it. In fact, he was so confident the ships would hold that he happened to notice another island on his way back north. This was the island of Gozo, which is the second largest island in the Malta archipelago. So he steered the ships that way. Making landfall, he quickly overtook that island and forced loyalty to him there as well. At this point, it was time for Roger to head home, lest this become a bit of a Norman odyssey, God forbid. So, what was this all about in the grand scheme of things, this Norman conquest of Malta? Well, it didn't amount to much, really, in terms of land acquisition or maritime dominance or even political expansion. Malta wasn't quite yet the strategic jewel it would one day become. But what this little weekend warrior foray into Malta shows us is that the tides were turning in the Christian world. Was Roger making his moves on Sicily primarily out of religious zeal or animosity toward Islam? Certainly not. And anyone making that argument should be laughed out of the room. It was pure Norman expansionism at work, plain and simple. Malta, no different. Gozo, why not? While we're here, might as well. Norman expansionism was a powerful force in those days, which can be explained once again by the very Norman practice of primogeniture, the practice of land, titles, and wealth being given to the eldest son, and to hell with the rest of the kids, right? The Normans who flooded southern Italy and Sicily were victims of primogeniture in large part. Normandy was swelling due to the prosperity of its dukes since before the turn of the 11th century, and these younger sons had nowhere to go but south. When England opened up, there was England, but southern Italy and Sicily still held vastly more opportunities for them. So, Malta shows us the powerful force of Norman expansionism at work, but it also showcased something very important that would come to pass in the coming years. See, the borderlands separating Islam from Christianity, these were used to be no man's lands, but that was quickly changing. There used to be somewhat of a buffer between the emirates of Arabs and the kingdoms and empires of Europeans. Whether you were in eastern Rome, southern Italy, Sicily, or Iberia, there was a largely empty and unpopulated border that was seen as untouchable. No one in their right minds would live there. Is that to say no one lived there? Of course not, but comparatively speaking, no one really lived there. But these borders were closing, and they were closing fast, in the late 11th century. Now, with vastly increased trade between everyone around the Mediterranean, in Europe, in North Africa, and even as far as India and the Central Asian steppes, stories began leaking out of some Muslim-held lands of tragedies befalling Christians and Jews. And on the flip side, stories of the treatment of Muslims in largely Christian lands began leaking into Arab spheres as well. The borders were closing in on one another, and Sicily, Malta, and Iberia show us that Christians were beginning to push back. Iberia was once entirely Christian, as was Malta, Sicily, southern Italy, the Holy Land, Anatolia, and even Egypt. But since the lightning-fast, militaristic, sometimes horrifically brutal expansion of Islam between the early 600s and 1000s, between this time, these had all fallen into Muslim hands. Again, Malta shows that Roger didn't have to go and make Malta Christian, but he did, just like he did with Sicily. Just like the Christian kingdoms in Iberia were pushing back south, conquering places like Zaragoza, Valencia, and a biggie, Toledo. And just like what's about to happen in just a few short years in Anatolia and across the Holy Land. Malta is just another puzzle piece in the much larger Christian movement to retake lands they considered stolen by Muslims. When Count Roger returned to Sicily, he set those freed Christians loose on Sicily, and they presumably just melted into the Sicilian tapestry. Well, okay, it was a bit more than that, actually. Roger let everyone make their own choice, but he offered to those who chose to remain in Sicily, he offered to build a village just for them. He paid for it out of his own expenses and exempted the village for as long as he lived from any and all taxes and levies. This village was called Villafranca, or Free Village. For those that decided to leave, maybe return home if they were able, he gave them free passage across the Strait of Messina to Calabria. And wherever those people went, they told stories of great Count Roger of Sicily, the man who freed them from Muslims in Malta for no reason but because he felt it the right thing. The propaganda game was strong, for sure. Now, turning to big picture things, Count Roger informed Pope Urban II of the miserable state of Malta, in Christian terms, that is, and asked the Pope to send someone to become the new Bishop of Malta. His name would be Gualtieri, for the record. He also sent vast sums of money with this new Bishop of Malta in order to rebuild a new cathedral in Medina. And in addition to this, he gave enough to build the chapel of Sant'Angelo on the island of Gozo as well. Churches quickly popped up all over Malta and Gozo after this, and historian Richard Brown tells us, quote, "As a sign of thanks, the church in Malta still says a mass at the cathedral on every 4th of November for the repose of the Count's soul," end quote. And what's more, Count Roger never sent a garrison to Malta either. Neither did his successors. In fact, it wasn't until 1224 when all Muslims were evicted from the island. With Sicily and Malta behind him, Count Roger turned to the mainland to help out his nephew, Roger Borsa. The city of Cosenza, here we are again, was in a prolonged rebellion now against Roger Borsa, and, well, enough was enough. In fact, Borsa was even able to convince his half-brother Bohemond to help him put down Cosenza as well. Just shows the oddity that was medieval relationships. So Borsa had his own levies, his uncle's Saracen levies from Sicily, and his rebellious half-brother's knights all converging on Cosenza. He set up siege operations by midsummer outside of the city on the plains in the distance. Count Roger took to the surrounding mountains where the terrain would be more difficult to advance upon. Once he'd taken these and scattered the enemy, mostly back to Cosenza, he ordered siege engines and towers to be built for his nephew. These were pushed right up to the gates of Cosenza and effectively locked the doors in and out. There was no trade, no supplies, no reinforcements, no food, no movement whatsoever. But Cosenza knew not to tussle hand to hand with Norman knights, so they relied primarily on their archers and those proficient with a slingshot. And where young, brash Roger Borsa was ready to level the place out of spite for daring to rebel against him, wizened Uncle Roger took his typical tact when approaching the situation. He'd effectively cut them off. He held all negotiating leverage in this situation, period. Full stop. So Malaterra describes the way he tried to resolve this potentially deadly situation. Quote, "The Count meanwhile made every conceivable effort both to persuade the enemy to surrender and, more often, to discourage them by force of arms. He devoted himself to his men, encouraged them, went everywhere, left nothing undone that could be done, was at the head of his men in battle and the last to retreat, and by his example and attention to duty he made everyone more zealous. Seeing the Count's unslackening determination and losing hope of driving their enemies from their territory, the people of Cosenza discussed the matter among themselves and made plans for the surrender of the town." End quote. Borsa may have been Duke, but Count Roger was clearly the man in charge. All knew it, even the rebels. What's more is that they sought Count Roger's counsel prior to reaching out to Duke Roger Borsa, too. And with this, Count Roger all but forced Roger Borsa to take back the city and to give all people involved in the rebellion some grace and forgiveness. Now, what came of this was a learning opportunity for Count Roger's nephews. Initial force is certainly necessary, but once both sides are aware of the entire situation, then diplomacy must be the next step. Odds are, it'll work, and you've kept your men alive and unharmed to fight another day. In exchange for his uncle's services, Roger Borsa gifted the Count half of the city of Cosenza itself, which was a nice bit of taxation, mind you. Beyond that, Borsa did punitively construct a central citadel and tower to garrison with his own men to keep Cosenza from trying anything again. But interestingly, Count Roger also built a citadel in his part of town. Honestly, I don't know what to make of that, but it certainly sets up an interesting dynamic between uncle and nephew. Malaterra writes, quote, "The Count's son, Jordan, was popular with everyone because of his valor, and many people conjectured that he was the Count's heir, since Geoffrey had been afflicted by leprosy and the Count had no other male child." End quote. It was with these words that we learn the situation regarding succession of Count Roger's titles, wealth, and land. First, Jordan was still around, right next to his dad on most of his ventures around Sicily and beyond, and we know that Jordan was given control of Sicily itself while Dad was away a handful of times already. And second, Count Roger's heir, Geoffrey, was stricken with leprosy at some point. Now, I can't find in Malaterra's works or Richard Brown's works anything about Mauget, who was technically right behind Geoffrey, except that Mauget was named Count of Troina, but why he wasn't included here is unknown. That said, Geoffrey sadly died of his affliction, most likely between the years 1090 and 1091, around this Malta situation. And with nothing being said about Mauget, Count Roger was left with one option: Jordan. But Jordan was a phenomenal pick for heir, so what was the problem? We can't forget about the Norman practice of primogeniture and how powerful it was ingrained in the entire Norman system, whether up in Normandy or down south in the Mediterranean. For Mauget to be overlooked in the records, with the focus shifting to illegitimate Jordan, must mean this Mauget guy was quite a piece of work. But in 1092, the next we hear of Jordan is that he was sick with fever in Syracuse. Count Roger made his way to Sicily's southeastern corner to check on his boy as he juggled his thoughts about succession. Malaterra writes, quite abruptly, quote unquote, Jordan's last moment arrived faster than did his father. Yeah, it hit just like that. Jordan was dead. Now, Malaterra again, quote, "The Count entered the city, and as he saw his son's funeral rites, he was seized with unbearable sadness. All those who were with him shared his grief and broke into tearful lamentation. Many were moved to tears much more by his father's grief than by Jordan's death. The whole city resounded to tearful wailing, to such an extent that it caused tears even among the Saracens, the enemies of our race, not indeed out of real love, but rather because of kindly emotions stirred when they saw sadness afflicting our people. The Count ordered the proper funeral ceremonies and brought his son's body to Troina, there to be solemnly buried into the portico of the church of St. Nicholas." End quote. His nephew Tancred years earlier, his heir Geoffrey a year or two before, and now his beloved Jordan. Count Roger was overcome with grief, as you can imagine. And it was then that a town under Jordan's rule, Pentalica, a town made up primarily of Muslims, rose in rebellion, publicly celebrating the death of their overlord. Well, one way to vent one's frustrations in the Middle Ages, I suppose, was to walk out of a funeral and ride against a revolt. Count Roger, typically the wise, diplomatic, calm, centered count, ruler, patriarch of the Normans in the south, one could say at this point. Well, it was a bad time, and Count Roger used extreme force. He hanged the leaders of, in Malaterra's words, quote unquote, "this ridiculous enterprise," which I quite like. Unceremoniously, he hanged them and punished the citizens for their insolence. Needless to say, the name Pentalica wasn't heard much after that. Now, with the death of Jordan in 1092, Malaterra treats us to another poem, which I'll spare you of, but it mentions the happiest news a grieving couple could receive upon the deaths of two sons. A baby's born. In 1093, Count Roger and young Adelaide, as I said at the top of the show, welcomed their firstborn, a boy who is named Simon. Malaterra writes, quote, "Let the pain of death once heavy and strong from the loss of a son be softened and forgotten by hope with this joyful birth." End quote. But back on the mainland, Duke Roger Borsa was stricken with sickness too in early 1093. And apparently, like his father before him, this one was pretty bad. Borsa's wife, Adela, daughter of Duke Robert the Frisian of Flanders and niece of the King of France. So, yeah, Borsa was connected to some pretty powerful people, it's worth noting. Well, the wife Adela sent for the best doctors to check out her husband, and everyone seemed to come up empty. Malaterra writes, quote, "The most learned doctors in those parts were present, but he was so far out of his senses, and the case was so unusual, that there was no symptom, neither pulse, nor urine, nor any other indication, which allowed doctors to diagnose his illness. Since even the doctors appeared to despair of him, the news of this event, implying that he was already dead, caused mayhem throughout Apulia and Calabria." End quote. Well, dear listeners, you and I have been together a long time, and I trust you all know what is about to happen in a situation like this one. That's right. Bohemond hears word of his half-brother's supposed death and instantly takes numerous castles in Calabria, not even waiting for confirmation of the death. But wait, wait! He wasn't taking them to control them. No, Uncle Roger, relax. Bohemond only took all these places under his leadership in order to keep peace, should the Duke truly be dead. Yes, that's it. He was honoring his brother and sought only to be guardian. Yeah, that's the ticket, yeah. Uncle Roger didn't buy it for a second, though. He gathered a small army and marched into Calabria, sending Bohemond skittering back home to Taranto. But he wasn't the only one to rebel. Bohemond was at the very least more on a campaign of securing support should Borsa be truly dead. Another just flat out rebelled. And that guy's name was William Grandmesnil. Might be a familiar name to you, Grandmesnil. William Grandmesnil was the son of Hugh Grandmesnil, a fairly well-known figure in the Norman conquest of England, and the younger brother to Robert Grandmesnil, a Benedictine monk. Now dig deep into your memory on the show, and you'll remember how Count Roger's first wife, his one true love, Judith of Evreux, made it to Calabria in the first place, back I think it was 1061, right? The Grandmesnils found themselves in some hot water with Duke William up north. So on their way out of Normandy, Robert Grandmesnil, the monk, stole Judith away from a convent and reunited her with Count Roger, well, soon to be Count Roger. Well, accompanying them was William Grandmesnil, who spent the next couple of decades ingratiating himself with Guiscard, to the point that Guiscard married off one of his daughters to William Grandmesnil. Fast forward to 1093. Roger Borsa's deathly ill. Count Roger's focused on keeping the rambunctious Bohemond from striking at the duchies, and we see William Grandmesnil, feeling a little put out as a son-in-law of the late Duke Guiscard, actually trying to carve out a piece of Borsa's domain for himself. So it took some pretty tense months to recover, but Borsa did just that, much to his doctor's surprises. Malaterra tells us, quote, "But after being delirious and out of his senses for a long time, the Duke recovered consciousness and began to get better. Bohemond heard of this and with great presence of mind hurried to Melfi, where he knew his brother to be, to congratulate him on the restoration of his health. He returned the castra, which he had bound to himself, and showed that what he had formerly done had not been done with any evil intentions." End quote. Yeah, so with a clever bit of maneuvering, Bohemond saved major face in the situation. The same cannot be said for William Grandmesnil, who chose neither to visit Borsa and Melfi, nor to acknowledge the Duke's recovery, and I'm sorry, in a feudal system, you have to do those things. It's an obligation, whether you like the guy or not. Now, Count Roger was once again pretty annoyed at one of his nephews, this one, of course, a nephew by marriage, but all the same. And he mobilized on behalf of Borsa, who, of course, was still recovering. But Borsa wasn't having any of it either. Borsa raised his head off his sweaty pillow, threw off his nasty comforter, and sprang out of bed like Grandpa Joe heading to the chocolate factory. Borsa, too, raised an army, and Bohemond even lent him a force consisting of levies from Taranto and Otranto. All three of them descended upon William Grandmesnil's city of Castrovillari. But here's the thing, and it just goes to show that even as deep into Norman Apulia and Calabria as Castrovillari was, there were still large pockets of Greek Orthodox communities, Lombards essentially, who truly resented their Catholic overlords, let alone them being Norman. Borsa, Count Roger, and Bohemond, they were all Norman, and they were all Catholic. And they were Hautevilles to boot. These Calabrians wanted none of it. As Borsa led his men through the Val de Crati, which is the valley, toward Grandmesnil's city, he had to move slowly and cautiously, and he found pockets of light resistance, which he quickly quelled. Each of these armies met with a similar resistance the deeper into Calabria they invaded, so by the time they met near Tarsia, they were all a bit harassed, but in good spirits. Grandmesnil was given safe passage soon after this, and Grandmesnil pleaded his case to the Duke, with Count Roger and Bohemond both in attendance. He admitted his guilt, tried to explain it, but he stuck to his guns either way. He deserved more than what he was given after Guiscard's death, in his view. The men couldn't agree on terms, so Grandmesnil rode away, fully aware that he would be defending himself shortly. A siege occurred, and after just 3 weeks, Castrovillari was crippled to the point of surrender. William Grandmesnil only conceded this on condition that his legal case could be heard. Yeah, isn't medieval politics fun? In exchange for the siege to be lifted, Grandmanuel offered up his castle on good faith to Borsa. Should he win the case, he would be rewarded the castle back, the city, and the surrounding lands as his own. Should he lose, Grandmanuel would lose everything. Well, he gave his speeches, but the guy had a terrible case of hubris. It was quickly ruled that Grandmanuel was guilty, so he not only lost his lands, but he also lost all of his titles and wealth, everything. William Grandmanuel picked up his stuff, what little he could keep, and he and his wife self-exiled where all southern Italian people went into exile, Constantinople. And you better believe Emperor Alexius Komnenos welcomed them with open arms. And hey, would you look at that? A daughter of Guiscard, in the end, still ended up in a Byzantine court. It's funny how things work out, isn't it? But as medieval soap operas went, the Grandmanuels would eventually be allowed back in Calabria, and if you can possibly believe it, even restored all of his lost titles and land to him. So, we've seen the remaining Hautevilles in the south not only break down, bicker, and even come to blows, but we've also seen them expand their territories, join forces, and rally, all within the span of a decade between the death of the powerful Robert Guiscard and the beginning of the First Crusade. Now, I know I said on the last episode that we'd also see an appearance of one Countess Matilda, a medieval figure I'm infinitely fascinated with, personally. However, after rethinking the episode, expanding Count Roger's invasion of Malta in order to give it its proper due, and focusing more on the drama within the Hauteville clan, I've decided to push it to the next episode. Like medieval history itself, this podcast is an ever-moving target, and I've come to be okay with that. We will get to it all in due time. My goal for this show in its final analysis, whenever that may be, is that we've given our shared history the patience and credit it deserves, warts and all. So where do we find ourselves at the end of this episode? Well, we will depart southern Italy and Sicily for now, leaving Roger Borsa tenuously in charge of his father's domains, made possible entirely by the support of his powerful uncle, Great Count Roger of Sicily. Without Roger the Elder, Borsa would have surely been booted by Bohemond. I think that's pretty safe to say. And speaking of Uncle Roger, Sicily is now completely his, completely out of Muslim hands, in Norman control, and completely under the purview of the Bishop of Rome. However, with that said, Count Roger's making it a major talking point for everyone on the island to know that Catholicism may be the overall spiritual leader on the island. Greek Orthodox, Judaism, and Islam are also all still welcome, so long as their practices don't disrespect, blaspheme, or interfere with Catholic practices. In fact, it seems that Count Roger might actually prefer the cooperative nature of various religions coexisting with one another. Crazy, I know. Now, in addition to Sicily, Count Roger expanded his domain into the island chain of Malta for no other reason but to keep his fighting men busy for the time being. Malta is now officially Catholic as well, it's worth mentioning, complete with its own bishopric to boot. And finally, we leave Bohemond. Oh, Bohemond. Smarting from his loss of not only his lost inheritance, at least in his mind, of Guiscard's domains in Italy, but he's also smarting from the loss of the Balkans, which were surely going to be willed to him should the invasion work out. For the better part of a decade, Bohemond clawed his way into his own piece of his missing inheritance. And by the eve of the First Crusade, he was sitting pretty nicely as the Prince of Taranto and ruler of other big cities and wealthy ports, such as Otranto and Bari. He doesn't know it, but in just one short year, his life would change forever, and he would rise from the ranks of an historical footnote into the ranks of medieval legend. Mark my words, don't sleep on Bohemond. So, I ask again for your patience. We are almost finished rounding out life at the cusp of the First Crusade. I'm just as excited as you to get to it, but this background information is pretty necessary. History does not happen in a vacuum. Context matters, folks. Until next time.